The moment the handcuffs clicked, the entire room went so quiet I could hear someone's phone buzzing in the back row, and Cordelia Ashworth Vane, who'd spent years acting like she owned the lake, the land, and every breathing person around it, stared at me like I'd just pulled the ground out from under her heels. Her light blue suit was still perfect, her pearls still sat at her throat, but her voice cracked into something raw and ugly as the federal agent read her rights in front of 400 stunned residents. And all I could think was 3 weeks ago she stood on my porch calling me a squatter, and now she was being marched out of her own HOA meeting like a criminal who finally ran out of places to hide. 3 weeks earlier, I didn't even know her name, and I sure as hell didn't expect to be the reason her whole empire imploded. But grief has a funny way of sharpening your instincts, and when you're pushed hard enough, eventually something in you stops bending. 18 months before that night, my wife Clara died, and I'm not going to romanticize it. There was nothing poetic about it, nothing clean. It was hospital lights, paperwork, exhaustion, and that moment when a doctor's mouth moves and your brain refuses to understand the words, because accepting them means your entire life is about to split down the middle. After the funeral, I tried to do the responsible thing. I stayed steady for our daughter Marlo, who was 16 and already too old to be protected by childish denial and too young to carry all that loss without it turning into something dangerous. We lived in the same house with the same hallway where Clara used to hum while she watered plants, with the same kitchen where she used to lean against the counter and make fun of how I loaded the dishwasher like it was a tactical operation. Every room felt haunted, and not in the fun Halloween way, more like every corner was waiting to ambush us with memories. I got up, I made breakfast, I drove Marlo to school, I went through the motions, but inside I was just grinding, surviving. The worst part wasn't even the sadness. It was the silence after. Clara was the strategist in our family, the one who noticed things, the one who could read people like open books, the one who'd tilt her head and say, "That doesn't add up," and then 10 minutes later she'd have the thread that unraveled the whole lie. Without her, I felt like I was walking through fog with one shoe missing. We moved. First it was supposed to be temporary. New town, new start. Fresh air, less pressure, but temporary, became months and months, became a year and a half of motels and rental houses, and me pretending each move was a choice instead of a symptom. Then a lawyer found me. Not an email, not a voicemail. An actual call from an actual person who sounded almost relieved to hear I existed. He told me my grandfather, Everett Caldwell, had died at 94, and he'd left me a property in Montana, Caldwell Ranch. 847 acres, cabin, lake shoreline, all of it. I told him he had the wrong Caldwell. He said gently, "No, he didn't." My father had left Montana before I was born and never spoke about his family, and when my father died when I was 22, I assumed the line ended there. Turns out it didn't. The lawyer overnighted a lockbox to a motel we were staying in, like he was afraid if he waited I'd vanish again. And inside were 3 things that changed the temperature of my life. In one breath, a 1934 survey map showing the original boundaries of the ranch in meticulous detail. The entire lake included every inch of shoreline marked. A federal water rights certificate from 1952 stamped with the seal of the Army Corps of Engineers designating the lake as a navigable waterway under federal jurisdiction, and a handwritten letter in my grandfather's shaky script that said, "When you read this, someone will have tried to take what belongs to our family. Use what your father taught you. I have been waiting 60 years for someone who would know how to fight back." I read it 3 times, and I sat there on that motel bed with the paper trembling a little in my hands, because the truth smacked me in the face. My father hadn't just been obsessed with property law and water rights for fun. He'd been preparing me. He'd taught me about easements and riparian rights and federal jurisdiction over navigable waters like other dads teach baseball. I used to roll my eyes, half listen, thinking it was his quirky passion. Now I understood it had been training, and he never got the chance to tell me why. I'd spent 16 years after college working for the Federal Water Rights Division building cases, following money, documenting violations, testifying 47 times, and winning 47 times. It was my job to dismantle people who thought paperwork and power could protect them. Then Clara got sick, and I walked away from that life because I wanted more time at home and because I was tired of living inside other people's corruption. I thought I was done with that world. Montana had other plans. The drive to the ranch was long, the kind of long where the world turns into highway lines and gas station coffee and your own thoughts rattling around too loud. The closer we got, the less civilization looked real. The road into the property wasn't maintained. It bounced my truck over ruts like it was trying to shake us off. Pine trees stood thick and old, and when the rusted gate finally appeared, it looked like something time forgot. Caldwell Ranch, private property. No trespassing. The letters faded but defiant. I stopped the truck and just stared at it, and for the first time since Clara's funeral, I felt something other than grief in my chest. Not happiness. Something like permission to breathe. Marlo pretended she didn't care, headphones around her neck, eyes on her tablet, but she kept glancing out the window like she was checking whether beauty was allowed to exist after loss. When the cabin finally came into view, 2 stories, hand-hewn, cedar logs, stone fireplace, loft windows catching the light. Marlo's breath caught. The lake behind it looked unreal turquoise and emerald, depending on how the sun hit the surface. Mountains reflected so perfectly it made the world look upside down. Marlo whispered, "Mom would have loved this," and I swallowed hard because I wanted to say, "I know, I know, I know," but saying it felt like it would crack something open I didn't have the strength to hold. That afternoon, while Marlo explored inside and made little sounds of surprise at the view and the old furniture and the smell of cedar, I stayed on the porch reading the letter again, letting the words sink in, letting my grandfather's warning crawl under my skin. Someone will have tried to take what belongs to our family. I thought, dramatic, much old man. And then the hum started. It wasn't a car engine. It was smaller electric smug. 3 white golf carts came rolling out of the trees from the north side of my property, and my first thought was, that's impossible. According to the survey map in my hands, there shouldn't be any access from that direction. No road, no trail, no right-of-way. Yet here they were, like they'd done it 1,000 times. The woman who stepped out of the lead cart moved like she owned everything she could see. Light blue suit tailored so perfectly it shouldn't have survived a single pine needle. Pearls so expensive they probably had their own insurance policy. Platinum hair pulled back tight like control was a hairstyle. She looked at me not as a person, but as an obstacle. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume," she said, voice honey over broken glass. "I'm Cordelia Ashworth Vane, president of the Silvervale Summit Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your situation." My situation. The way she said it, like I'd wandered into her office without an appointment. 2 men flanked her. One carried a clipboard thick with papers. The other held what looked like a surveyor's transit, though he gripped it like a prop. Cordelia gestured at the lake in a sweeping motion, presenting it like a showroom feature. "This lake has been Silvervale Summit's amenity for 23 years. Our residents pay premium fees for exclusive access. Your cabin sits on what we consider community waterfront." I let silence stretch. Not out of politeness, out of strategy. In my old job, silence made people fill gaps with confession. Cordelia couldn't stand the gap. "I have here a comprehensive list of violations," she continued, nodding for clipboard guy to shove papers toward me. "Unauthorized structure on HOA adjacent land. Failure to register with community management. Blocking established recreational easement. Inadequate landscaping maintenance. Improper exterior paint colors." The list was so ridiculous, it almost would have been funny if it wasn't delivered with the certainty of a woman used to ruining people's days for sport. "Easement," I interrupted, because that one word mattered. "You mentioned an established easement." "Of course," Cordelia said like I was slow. "The community has used this waterfront for over 2 decades. I kept my voice neutral. An easement requires two things, Mrs. Ashworth Vane: a formal agreement between property owners and registration with the county recorder. Could you provide me with the registration number? For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, a micro-expression uncertainty disguised as arrogance. "The documentation is with our legal team," she said sharply. "I understand," I replied, soft. "When you locate it, please send me a copy. In the meantime, you're standing on private property without permission. I'll need to ask you to leave." That's when she stepped closer, close enough that her perfume tried to drown the pine air. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, voice dropping, "you seem to misunderstand how things work here. Silvervale Summit has resources, connections. This community was built by the most powerful families in Montana. You're just one man in a rundown cabin. Think very carefully about your next move." I met her gaze without blinking. 16 years of interrogations had trained me to hold a stare until the other person's confidence starts itching. "I have thought very carefully," I said. "That's why I'm here." She held my eyes for a few seconds too long, like she was searching for fear. When she didn't find it, she snapped her head away and marched back to her cart. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys," she threw over her shoulder, "and you will regret this conversation." The carts disappeared down the trail that shouldn't have existed, and I stood there on my porch watching dust settle, feeling something cold slide into place. Marlo came out behind me and asked, "Who was that?" I forced a casual tone. "A problem," I said, "but not one we can't handle." I wanted to believe that. 72 hours later, the problem showed up in fluorescent orange. I woke at 6:15 a.m. to find 9 violation notices plastered across my front door like warning posters. Each one was more absurd than the last. Unauthorized residential structure on HOA adjacent property, $10,000. Unpermitted dock construction, $5,000. Failure to submit architectural plans, $15,000. Blocking community water access, $20,000. Noise violation, $2,000. Improper waste disposal, $2,000. Unauthorized vehicle storage, $1,000. Landscaping maintenance, $4,000. Total, $42,000. Payment due in 14 days. I took photos of every notice because my old habits don't die, and because something about the accusations felt less like bureaucracy and more like a pattern. The cabin didn't have a dock. The cabin had existed for decades before the HOA was formed. There was no noise besides wind and the occasional bird. They weren't trying to enforce rules. They were trying to scare me into leaving. Marlo stood in the doorway, hair messy from sleep, studying the orange papers like she was analyzing a crime scene. "Dad," she said, voice tight, "those golf cart tracks from yesterday. They came from the North Trail." She walked past me and pointed at the survey map on the wall. "Look, their subdivision only has one road in, from the south, but those carts came through our property. That means they've been using our land as a shortcut." I stared at her, and grief punched me because Clara would have noticed the same thing. Marlo traced the topography lines. "Not just a shortcut," she said. "It's the only flat route to the lake. If they can't use it, they'd have to go around the mountain. That's like 45 minutes longer." She looked up at me, and her eyes were too old for 16. Mom would have noticed, she whispered, then walked back inside before I could answer. That afternoon, I drove the perimeter of the ranch, and what I found made my skin go cold. Trails, multiple, worn deep into the earth. 2 boat launches built on my shoreline with permanent dock structures. A pump station 50 meters from the water with pipes running toward the direction of the HOA. Electrical conduits, water lines, gravel paths like little arteries feeding their community amenity. They hadn't just trespassed. They'd built infrastructure on land that didn't belong to them, and they'd done it long enough that the ground had accepted it. I took 200 photos, GPS tagged every location, documented every structure, because the difference between losing and winning is often the quality of your evidence file. The next morning I went to the county recorder's office before it even opened. I arrived at 7:45, and while I waited I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It had followed me from the ranch. It didn't move. Inside the clerk, a woman named Opal, mid-50s, tired eyes looked at me.